Hi, I'm Tim Lennon, Executive Director at Langston.
And I'm Jasmine Scott, the Program Manager at Langston. And I'm here to welcome you to the 18th Annual Seattle Black Film Festival, our second fully online festival.
We look forward to rejoining you here in person soon at the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute in Seattle's Central District. For now, stay healthy, get vaccinated, and enjoy all the programs we have to offer online.
We're so excited to launch this year's festival on a brand new platform, and we've added a ton of video on demand options as well as timed events for you to enjoy. So we're so glad that you could join us again virtually this year for the festival. If you'd like to learn more about the Seattle Black Film Festival, about Langston, about all of our other programs, or to donate in support of our programs, please visit langstonseattle.org.
On behalf of the Langston family, I want to thank our sponsors and each and every one of you for joining us here for this year's film festival. Enjoy the show.
Enjoy.
Welcome to Seattle Black Film Festival 2021. I'm Festival Director Andrea Stuart-Lehalle.
And I'm Zola Mumford, Festival Curator.
You made it. You're here, and we're so glad you joined us.
This year, we're excited to share over 70 films from across the diaspora, telling stories that elevate Black cinematic brilliance. Our stories? Stories that speak our truth.
Before we get started, here are a few notes about this year's festival.
This year, we are fully online, so you don't even have to leave your home to catch some of the best new films in Black independent cinema.
Please assume that any films in this year's festival may include mature content. Please do your best to make your own choices about what might be appropriate for you.
Also, we've done our best to deliver an accessible festival, so some of our films do feature closed captioning or subtitles.
A huge thank you to Langston and our entire filmmaking community and filmmakers of this year's official selection. We are so excited. Have a great festival.
And thank you for joining us for Seattle Black Film Festival 2021.
Welcome to Seattle Black Film Festival 2021. I'm your festival director, Andrea Stuart-Lehalle, and we are so glad that you joined us. And we hope you're enjoying the festival. You can enjoy our video on demand selection through April 26th. For more information on tickets and the festival program, please visit langstonseattle.org. This afternoon, our conversation is focused around decolonizing the narrative in our own voices. Leading this conversation, we are so pleased to have Jasmine Mahmoud. Jasmine Jamila Mahmoud is a curator, arts advocate, and historian of art and performance. She is assistant professor of arts leadership in the Department of Performing Arts and Arts Leadership at Seattle University, where she teaches classes including public policy and advocacy in the arts and Black Lives Matter, art leadership, theory, and practice. She previously taught at Washington University in St. Louis, where her courses included urban ethnography in St. Louis. Her research and teaching engaged performance studies, theater history, Black aesthetics, visual culture, aesthetic experimentation, race, feminist and queer of color critique, cultural policy, urbanism, and geography. An essayist, scholar, and arts journalist, her writing and interviews appear in Modern Drama, Performance Research, TDR, The Drama Review, Women and Performance, as well as in Art Forum, ASAP J Online, Canadian Art Review, Common Reader, HowlRound, Hyperallergic, Lit Hub, and South Seattle Emerald, where she writes a regular column centering BIPOC artists. Committed to arts advocacy, she currently serves as a Governor Inslee appointed Washington State Arts Commissioner, board president of Intiman Theater, and a board member on the boards. Jasmine, thank you so much for joining us this evening and bringing together this panel. Please take it away.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming. Today, I'm really honored to be moderating our brilliant panel today. The theme of this panel is decolonizing the narratives in our own voices. And I wanted to just give a little bit of brief words about that to frame our conversation today. We can think about this term decolonization in Black and Indigenous sense. I think about scholars, Indigenous scholars, including Yves Tuck, and also Black scholars, including Frantz Fanon, who was French and Martinique, and talked about decolonization as this process that calls into question these colonial logics of exploitation and oppression. Also, with the theme of our panel, we can think about our voices and the importance of telling stories from the voices of Black people with films made by Black people. So with that, I want to just briefly kind of give attention to our amazing panelists. I'm joined today by Dr. Abimbola Abatan, Martin Douglas, and Dr. Brittnay Proctor. And I want to give them my ASL applause for being here. They're really, really brilliant minds. I'm going to start today by asking each one of them to briefly introduce themselves, tell us a little bit more about the work that you do. And I'll go in that order right now, but we'll switch up the order for the rest of today's conversation. So Ade, I'm going to turn it over to you first. Tell us more about you and what you do.
Certainly. So thank you, Jasmine, for having me be part of the panel. Really excited to be part of the conversation this afternoon. And a little bit about me. So I would say succinctly, I'm a collage artist, I'm an engineer, and someone who's currently getting a MFA in arts leadership at Seattle University. And so I'm definitely coming to this in a couple different ways. My background is I'm originally from Nigeria. And so I have this idea of how the visual arts especially can be used to expand kind of historical narratives, both for kind of Africans here and Africans back home as well, and just really building on our conversation. So a lot of the films were really interesting from that perspective. So again, really glad to be here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ade. And Martin, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. I am a arts and culture journalist. I specify in the world of music. That is where I've gained most of my reputation. As one of the few Black rock and roll writers in all of music journalism, I speak a lot to racial identity in my writing. And I am a longtime resident of Tacoma. I moved here in 1998. And yeah, my work my work spans across multiple genres, including the wild world of professional wrestling, where I also write about, race relations and culture. And basically, I am a Black person in a space, a lot of different spaces with not a lot of Black people. So I want to share my experience so that these worlds become more diverse with our voices.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Martin. And Brittnay, I'd love to hear more about you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brittnay Proctor. I am a writer and scholar. Most of my work comes in and through Black popular music of the 20th century, and by way of Black feminism and Black feminist critique. In general, I'm interested in writing about Black popular culture, and to some extent Black films. So I'm really excited to talk today about the films in question and think about the ways that these different filmmakers are either buckling down on colonial notions of narrative, and in the ways that other artists are, the majority of the filmmakers in question today are trying to decolonize narrative and how we can narratively represent film. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Super happy that you're here. Super happy that all y'all are here. So first question, I'd love just to hear initial reactions to any of the films that you watch. I'll give you a few of mine. I was struck by Temple, kind of about the encroachment of Temple University in North Philly, and the filmmaker. It's interesting when you read the description, the filmmaker talks about how he shot the film, wasn't happy with it, and then went back and did these like shots of people, of North Philly residents. And so I love those shots. And there was one shot where like this little kid was like trying to hold still and he just like burst out laughing. And so that was really beautiful. And the music, I feel like the sounds of Philadelphia musicians and artists. A Promising Voice was really moving to me about, I think, Decarius Dawson, the graduating music student, and like just the joy of him playing, but also his family. I teared up. Something about it was just like, it was just nice to see a Black kid be successful and graduate from college. I'm like tearing up right now. And then I really like The Natural Choice. And it kind of had this like, for lack of a better word, it kind of had like a Tyler Perry feel to the film. Like I appreciate all your nods. And I like that like shady white woman, something about it. I was just getting really upset. So those are some of the things that I kind of remember. I'd love just to hear from you all, like what was memorable to you, remarkable, surprising. I'm going to throw it to Martin first to ask you some of the things that you remembered about the film.
All right. So first, I loved A Promising Voice. Like it was equally heartwarming to me to see, especially working in the music world and like not necessarily being college educated. Like I am a community college dropout. So I think the idea of exploring your love for music in an academic way is just wonderful. And I thought that was very well done. And in A Natural Choice, I thought it was very interesting, like the conversation between Carlene and Lisa in particular, because as you were saying, Jasmine, she is pretty shady. And I thought about it in the context of capitalism and how this woman, Lisa, is basically manipulating her friend into changing her hairstyle for the sake of capitalism. And like I definitely thought that in the idea of Lisa coming to Carlene as a friend was indicative of how capitalism underlies everything we do, but also like the whole notion of body image came up when that offhanded line, I think it was Lisa saying to Carlene, you didn't have those breasts in college, which is, it's very, like I keep saying manipulative, but yes, it's very manipulative, but also indicative of how capitalism kind of undercuts everything, right? And so the idea that changing your body image in the way of breast augmentation is the same as changing your natural hairstyle is ludicrous to all of us, and is a very deep issue of identity. But someone with white privilege doesn't necessarily have that groundwork, have that framework in their mind, especially when they're, you know, in the corporate world, just trying to get somebody to straighten their hair. So yeah, that's what I spent a lot of time thinking about.
I love it. Awesome. Thanks, Martin. Brittnay.
I really enjoyed watching all of these films. And you know, being in quarantine, it's like, yes, please give me film, give me things that I can, you know, watch while I'm quarantined at home still. But I think, and we'll talk a bit about Temple, I think later on. So I really love Temple as a just an assemblage of Black sound and bringing, you know, Black working class narrative alongside Black working class performers, and trying to reimagine space in relationship to like a place that's being gentrified and encroached upon by way of Temple University. I love that, and that really stuck out to me, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that more. The film Decolonizing the Narrative really struck me because literally, well, right now, Penn Museum is facing backlash regarding a particular collection that it has of the remains of formerly enslaved African people and indigenous people, like the skulls and bones of these folk, right? And so that doesn't really come up in the film in any real way. And so it's very peculiar and morbid that the museum is trying to reimagine this very particular collection of African material culture, but never once broaches the conversation around, right? What does it mean to be still in holding of the remains of human people, and so that really struck me. I loved A Promising Voice. I, you know, very personally, like I'm a music nerd, and just, you know, to see Decarius, like, and first generation Black college student, like, yes, like I was like, yes, this was my experience. And it also made me kind of pissed off that, you know, to see some of the ways that Black undergraduates that are first generation coming from the working class still have to struggle through college, don't have the structures to support them. And in many ways, they're being asked to support others when they already don't have the forms of support that they need to thrive and survive in these institutions. So that was like, it was beautiful to see Decarius like eventually graduate, and along the way, you know, find his own way and mentor students. But you know, some of what stuck with me was the way that you know, Black undergraduate students are still called to do all of this unpaid labor to ensure that other Black undergraduates or first, you know, we use the term first generation undergraduates as like a kind of lumping in term, but a lot of, you know, Black and brown undergraduates, first generation undergraduate students do a lot of that work to make sure that students have what they need when the institution should be doing that. So yeah, those are some of the things that stuck out to me preliminarily.
Thanks, Brittnay. Ade?
Yeah, I think a lot of the same perspectives about a natural. Well, it was interesting to me, I think, to kind of be viewing some of these from the perspective of just the aesthetics of what I was seeing. Like, yeah, that flows. What happened in that edit? And then moving past that to, okay, what's the actual experience that's being conveyed here? A promising voice, like I think, like we've all talked about, stuck out to me. I thought there was the work that he was having to do, but I also think it was really interesting to hear his mentor or advisor, the gentleman who had actually recruited him to the school, talk about how music programs and the fact that they are static and what we consider the classics, by nature of saying that these are the classics and these are the only things, it cuts off completely part of the population that would even have an identification with wanting to be there. But the thing that struck me more about that was, yes, so now you introduce jazz and the blues and things that are quintessentially American, but do we even, as like, does the larger white American population realize that they are also living under a colonized mentality as to what is classic, right? And so it's kind of that duality of, yes, it suppresses the voices of Black people, but it also suppresses what it means to be an American. What are the classics in that? And you see that a couple of times in the films, right? So I thought that was interesting. I loved the Decolonizing the Narrative for a couple of reasons. I mean, this is really kind of my jam. Like, this is what I think is the power of the arts, to put something that would maybe be just in a dusty old book and bring it to the surface and actually make it interesting. But there are a couple of things that struck me. One was seeing it's always nice to see like museums from where I come from and some of what they are trying to do. And, that common refrain of like, no, bring it back. Yeah, whatever it is, bring it back. We want it all back, whether that was Benin or Badagry or wherever. But it was actually the folks in Dakar that I thought were interesting. So it was the director of the Museum of Black Civilizations, Hamadi Bokoum, and it was like, yes, I know there's a conversation happening in the West about decolonizing. I don't care. That's actually not my focus at all. And I thought of that whole, like, that there's definitely that perspective as well. It's like, we're doing our own thing. So y'all can keep doing what you're doing. It doesn't really matter. And thinking, how does that move the conversation forward, not move the conversation forward? And it's a legitimate perspective. But for those of us on this side in the West, right, but still keeping these ideas, how do you work with that, right? What do you do with that particular tension? And another thing I really, really liked was then another gentleman from one of the other museums there who talked about, so we want to work with the West, but it has to be more than just, we want this exhibit, could you send us something? Right? But actually talking about ways in which the conversation could be collaborative. And what I especially liked about that conversation was that is something that they're thinking about from their museum, but I can see that happening here as well in our different kind of realms, right? Of it's less about, okay, you're representing or you're doing a retrospective or you're highlighting this one person, but how are we actually collaborating to bring up better, how do we collaborate to bring up better ideas, better narratives, better work? How do you do that? And to me, that is the elevation that I was really keen to see, right? That's how we decolonize, because it's decolonizing the West, but also, where some of these indigenous places that this colonizing has happened. So yeah, those are the ones that stuck out to me the most.
Y'all are so smart. This is like a joy. I'm like smiling earnestly. Thank you all for all those opening comments. And I won't call on you from now on, so feel free to just jump in. Ade, I really appreciate kind of that nuance that you were bringing out about decolonization and kind of who's it for, right? Like, what does it mean to think about decolonization in a West African country versus being in kind of in the US or kind of in North America or South America, where there's a lot of stolen people and lands in those places. And so the first question, the second question I have for you all is about this decoloniality, decolonization, how you're thinking about this. And, films like Before Things Fell Apart and Decolonizing the Narrative, I think are really explicitly, and it was the same filmmaker, explicitly about kind of, you know, the repatriation of, you know, objects to countries where those things had been stolen from. But also I think we can think about kind of these waves of decolonization, especially as they land, and this is a really kind of like me-centric thing, but on the Black American body. So like, you know, I think about like Black poverty as like supporting Black wealth. It's like, what does it mean for Decolonius to be this first generation from working class parents? And like, I imagine his parents' conditions are supporting white wealth, sorry, Black poverty supporting white wealth. And then also the films I couldn't watch, I think just because of the events of not only this month, but the history of this country, but kind of thinking about violence against Black people. So like I could not watch The Subject, Oh America, I'll Never Be Your Son, and When We Try. And I might watch them, like I might eventually watch them during the festival, but I just like where I am right now, I couldn't watch them. So yeah, I'd love just to love you all to like just talk about how you see like decolonization, coloniality, kind of threading through these films. And I'm not going to call your name, so you all can just jump in where you want to.
I guess I could go. So Hamadi Bokoum's comments in Decolonizing the Narrative, he's the director of the Museum of Black Civilizations, but one of his comments was, museums are made as a consequence of colonial action. And that so profoundly struck a nerve with me, because I think some of the ways we think about decoloniality is, you know, you take an institution and you try to change it from the inside out, but there's never really a reckoning with it being an institution rooted in coloniality, like whether that's institutions in the United States, like the Penn Museum, or many institutions of higher education in the United States that are vested in and rooted in chattel slavery, indigenous genocide, i.e. settler colonialism, whether that's the colonization of the continent of Africa, and the continent of Africa's relationship to the transatlantic slave trade vis-a-vis the theft of humans, right, rendered and turned commodities, slaves, by way of the transatlantic slave trade, Middle Passage, and the arrival to the New World. I think sometimes we don't always reckon with these ruptures, which they actually are ruptures and tears in the world that are fundamentally changing the world as we know it. And so it's one thing to say, oh, these institutions are racist, right? But what does it mean to really reckon with these colonial histories and the afterlives of them, right? Because they're still haunting with us. There's still so much so animating our daily lives, whether we're in the United States, whether we're in Dakar, Senegal, whether it doesn't, the kind of global reach of colonization is animating our daily lives. And I think what Decolonizing the Narrative animates, what many of the films are animating, even A Promising Voice, right? To think about a place like Memphis, Tennessee, that has, its own relationship to the aftermath or the afterlife of slavery in the United States, where, a history of, Black working class folk rebelling and in many ways being punished, right? MLK is assassinated in Memphis. Like, there are these legacies in the afterlife of slavery that are that have so many resonances with the dispossession and theft and modes of violence and terror that Black folk have faced vis-a-vis these phenomena. And we never name or animate and say like a student like Decolonius is a colonial subject, but yet again, right, he's facing some of, or in different ways, facing modes of dispossession and, dispossession, theft of his time, of his energy, of his, I think in some ways, his spirit. His labor is being exploited, right? He has to work what he says, 3 to 4 jobs just to get through college. So there's all of these ways that these histories, right, we try to treat them as the past, but they're animating the contemporary moment. So I think decolonization, as it's being animated in and through all of these films as a way of trying to re-narrate Black life in the US, Black life in the continent of Africa, is trying to reckon with these ruptures and tears, even as we're trying to go back and re-narrate, right, ancient African civilizations that didn't carry the taint of slavery and colonization. Even those phenomena are drastically changing how we even name and talk about, right, those these ancient civilizations, because things were destroyed, things were looted, stolen, burned, destroyed. And so there's a real reckoning that I think is happening by way of these filmmakers, whether we acknowledge that or not. So I think decolonization in my mind is, a reckoning with these larger histories versus just saying we sprinkle in Black narrative here and there to make white people feel comfortable about their inheritance and what they get to actively benefit from, right? Just for the sake of being alive and on this earth. So yeah, that's it.
It's kind of hard to follow that, but I'll do my best. I feel as though in their own little ways, these films are trying to actively resist the colonization that we are taught in, the history books coming up in primary school and secondary school, what have you. And that's something that stood out to me in Before Things Fell Apart, getting this people's history of not only a people's history, but an ancient history of Western Africa and how it runs counter to what these history books taught us. And I thought a lot about gentrification, which is what I feel is a modern day corollary to colonization, like in Temple, where communities are being displaced because the school wants to build a stadium and of course makes more money. And going back to the things I said about capitalism, capitalism is so inextricably tied with colonization at this point that I believe that's why I keep bringing it up. And we're starting to see it everywhere. I'm from Tacoma, and the Hilltop neighborhood, which had been Black for a century, is starting to become gentrified. You're starting to see condos, you're starting to see the artistic class displaced out of Seattle, and Hilltop's where they're going because the rent is cheap. And I think Temple really stuck out to me because I'm also from a city called High Point, North Carolina. And I used to live right down the street from High Point College. And some 25, 30 years later, I meet a young man who is from High Point, and he's telling me about how High Point University has basically taken over the city. So I think that's a very, very distinct corollary to Temple, in the idea that High Point was a pretty heavily Black town before the university started making moves.
I think it's interesting because one of the things that I kept thinking about, and this is really highlighted in the Temple movie, was they keep talking about disrespect, right? There's this one elder who talks about how it's disrespectful that they're encroaching on our neighborhood. It's disrespectful that they don't acknowledge, right? Because I think it's almost like they understand change will happen. It's the manner in which that change is happening without acknowledging the people there that they have a major problem with. And it's the fact as well, it's taking in a way that is forcing them out, right? And I thought of that, like, isn't that the essence of the colonial mentality or the entitled mentality? It's really one that says our existence, our history, our way of knowing is just it. Whatever you're bringing to the table is secondary to this. So to me, some of the decolonial methods have to do about bringing that respect back in, right? About whose voice we're not listening to, or whose perspective, whether you're in a university or a museum or what have you, whose perspective are we not paying attention to right now? And yet they are the ones most impacted by what we are bringing forward, right? So I was thinking, Brittnay, you mentioned about the remains, right, of, I think you said slaves that are at Penn's museum. And I think there might be a point, these movies look like they were made in 2019 or edited in 2019 and released. And so maybe there's just a time difference there. But I think that was one of the points that was in the earlier part of Decolonizing the Narrative, right? Trying to hear the museum director say, we're trying to acknowledge, we're trying to rectify what's happening, right? But I was like, well, then who's helping you with that? Whose voice is in that conversation, right? And as you walk through your museum, it was fascinating to me to have the conversation about objects, for example, right? About how you just display these things, bones, artifacts, as just, here's a fact, and then moving on, and not the context around it. And so, and the majority or those of a colonial mindset are not going to be able to provide that perspective, and therefore they cannot provide that respect, right? You need those external voices, very much like these filmmakers are doing, to bring that perspective and to bring it in to say, no, there's more here, and how do we add that to the conversation? So it was, to me, that was the main thing that stuck out. It was very much about respect. And some people were like, we're gonna do us. And others were like, no, we're gonna demand it, right?
I'm going to keep saying that y'all are so smart, but y'all are so smart. It's really an honor to hear your thoughts. I wanted to kind of ask the next question that I think we can tie in with decoloniality to think about cinematography, but especially as an animated place. And I think that that's something that I thought about, and I'm someone who's like trained in urban ethnography, but I thought about that a lot, from, before things fell apart. And, I'm someone African-American, I've never been to the continent. So seeing images of like Mali and kind of this like brown river and the storyteller's story about the snake, and just like seeing place was really moving to me. I'm thinking about the place of University of Arkansas, this beautiful campus. I was like, oh, that campus is beautiful. And then also when Decarius was in Memphis and I Am a Man, walking in front of those murals, Philadelphia, and just kind of this like colorful urban landscape that I think was made more rich with the sonic work of those Black artists. And then even thinking about A Natural Choice, how I feel like that was filmed to be like, it had a very, I'm not hating it, I love that film, but it had this very like Tyler Perry Hallmark feeling, right? And it could be like anywhere USA. Like everything about it was like the office park, the car park, the home. And so I'm curious for you all, like how did cinematography have you think about place, and what else did it have you think about as you engaged these films?
Well, for me, location is something that I've long been obsessed with when it comes to film and television. Like I think I'm kind of a stickler when it comes to that sort of thing. Like I'm obsessed with authenticity. So when something is supposed to be filmed a certain place but is not, it kind of takes me out of the narrative or the story or whatever they're trying to convey. So I think in these movies, especially the ones like Before Things Fell Apart, where they go back to Africa, and it's like you see this vivid world that, like Jasmine, I've never been to Africa. I hope to do so someday, but I think that sort of thing is what gives a film its flavor. Like, and thinking about what Jasmine said about a natural choice. Like, I think that's another thing that's interesting about that movie, is that it's like the settings are very generic. You can't tell where it was filmed, so it could be anywhere. And I think that adds to the narrative because it's probably happening everywhere.
I'll say that Before Things Fell Apart was, I think, really the cinematography was able to, for me, like, not to fetishize the continent, but like the cinematography was so beautiful in that it could articulate the specificity of place and space, i.e. Mali. Like, I'd never been to the continent either, but you know, the way that the film was shot, as to not, you know, kind of import this kind of cosmopolitanism vis-a-vis a place like the US, and was very decolonial in its practice of like framing and the way that it chose to frame or the way that it chose to shoot particular frames, right? That it wasn't about this expert coming in and explaining away. It was very much so vested in capturing West African oral traditions. The role of the griot was so central to the film, and helped to really locate the viewer in a particular place and space that was so, you know, refreshing. In that, like, I think colonial renderings of the continent of Africa tried to homogenize the continent and make the continent seem as if it's you know, singular, and that, you know, that histories are monolithic, and that what this particular film was able to do is to bring viewers into a very specific place in space, and use, right, the narration of griots to bring us into that space and give a very important and particular history that you know, like others have said, that we don't always have access to, and that we are not taught. And A Natural Choice, I think, was, I don't know where it was shot, but it felt very familiar as a person from the West Coast of the United States. I was like, I feel like this is from the West. It's not shot on the West Coast somewhere, but I don't want to assume. And also the overly aggressive white woman definitely made me think that, like, this is definitely like shot on the West Coast somewhere, like super aggressive, super gets to throw a stone and hide her hand, right? She says, like, I don't care if you're recording me because I'll just lie and get off the hook. Not to say that's like a brand of white womanhood that doesn't, you know, translate across geography, but I just felt that her rendering was very specific to the West Coast. But I think, yeah, those are some of my thoughts on space and place vis-a-vis the films we watched.
I think it's. I was actually thinking it was Atlanta, so I love that, you know, it has that element of everywhere. But I was like, ooh, that feels like Georgia. But okay, they just didn't have like maybe the full accent of it. But that said, though, I thought it was interesting. For Before Things Fell Apart, I paid attention to the cinematography as well. I grew up in the northern part of Nigeria, and that's what that felt like. And so it was really interesting to hear them talk about how the Songhai Empire had stretched all the way to the northern part. I was like, oh, well, that makes sense then, why this feels really familiar, which is very different than if you're in the South where I'm from or anywhere else. So it was interesting to feel that continuity. But I loved how they included the animation. I like really overlaying it over the film. And I thought, for two reasons, it was beautifully done. It kind of gave that multi-layered storytelling. But I was also thinking about, okay, who are the folks that need to see this as well? And we're talking about mosques, and we're talking about Timbuktu, and we're talking about Gao, and we're talking about all these centers. But I also think of like younger generations who may not be, and kids who are not getting, we talked about, you know, the history in school, and how that becomes another entry point for them of like, well, what is this battle happening? Who are these people on horseback? What is this, you know, person in a turban? So I really loved that inclusion in how they did the film. I just thought it was a really interesting way to add to it. I'll contrast that with, I actually watched the subject, and it was difficult because of this week and another shooting, but also this one has to do with almost like a bypasser. I mean, like people passing by or standing by and not taking action. And it calls out allyship in a very interesting way. And so if I think of all the movies and which one looked like the most quote unquote super edited, you know, the music was hitting that's the one that comes to mind. And yet it still didn't resonate as much as some of the others, despite the fact that it was hitting and telling an interesting story, right? So it's just kind of pulling together that concept of like, I mean, this is what the arts are, this is what film is as well. Like, it has to have all those elements of like the place and the editing and the music and all these things, and the solid perspective as well to pull you all the way in. Yeah, but it was interesting just to contrast the two.
That's great. Thanks all. I really appreciate how you're thinking about plays in like really vivid, dynamic ways. This next question's about the university, and I think it was just the order in which I watched the films. I think I watched, maybe it wasn't this order, but I kind of thinking about kind of Temple, so about Temple University and its role in North Philadelphia, gentrification. And also the fact that Temple, I watched the credits and like Temple partially funded the film, which I'm like curious about that conversation, and also curious about like if they feel absolved, just like what that's like. And like, I think that's great. I'm like, get that money from Temple. And also what is that? And then, A Promising Voice and University of Arkansas, and kind of, that was, I feel like, more broadly about university culture and what it means for Black people, all people, especially given those like statistics. And then Decolonizing the Narrative with the role of Penn and the Penn Museum. And so I'm just curious, and then I think a lot of other films as well. I'm curious how you all saw at all like the role of the university in dialogue with the films that we watched for the festival.
I'll speak a bit to what I'm thinking about, and it's the fact that I feel like we're in transition when it comes to decolonizing these spaces. And so I don't know that you can get away from not having the institution, whatever the institution is. Either that you have people within the institution that now start to go, hold on, this is our role, we should do something about this. Or are able to bring the institution to bring that funding piece. But I don't know that we can get away from it. So to me, whether it's the museum or the university and so on, I'm actually glad to see where they show up in these places. Because I don't think I think we're still in a transition where we kind of have to be at the table. That's what it feels like to me.
From my perspective, like I'm thinking about A Promising Voice, and what really struck out to me and the thing that I wrote in my notes was representation matters, because there was a lot of talk about Decarius being the only Black student in his class and a first generation college graduate, and kind of having that foundation of support and encouragement. At the top of this discussion, I mentioned that I am a community college dropout. And I think that if I were to have that groundswell of support in my family, like I grew up among very working class people. I mean, I could say, a few of my elders brought up were openly anti-intellectual, which I think is, kind of a symptom of the working class. But yeah, like when I was a senior in high school and thinking about whether or not I would go to college, I ended up trying it out, and very, very briefly, and not doing so. But I wonder what could have been if I had the same foundation as Decarius of support. And we mentioned earlier about the structural aspect of being a college student. Like that is an overwhelming thing when you're first generation in college and you have to navigate that entirely by yourself. So those are all things that were kind of swirling through my head as I was watching A Promising Voice. And I had never really thought about it before I viewed that film.
I think, so I have very fraught feelings about institutions of higher education, and I think what some of my, I guess, I'll follow this through line of feeling just very fraught. Between A Promising Voice and Decolonizing the Narrative, right? They are all trying to animate the role of institutions in, shaping the lives of Black people, in various ways. And, for me, I think what enrages me a little bit is the way that institutions get to hide their hands in all of this, right? And they get to put money into these projects and help to fund them, and get to use, some of these films in ways that, they get to re-narrate themselves as trying to do something different or better, or trying to, engage in the practice of diversity and inclusion, whatever what that means. Like, what does that mean? What does that mean, right? And so I think that, for better or for worse, right, and trying to frame these conversations alongside institutions, garnering institutional support, which we automatically deserve. We shouldn't have to ask for it. They should just be giving us the point to make these films. The underbelly of that is that, the institution gets to say, look at what we did. Like, we are, look, we're not racist, we're not anti-Black, we don't come out of a colonial, like, a set of colonial actions or logics. Like, we're here to support our underprivileged students, right? We're here to make things right. And very much so, they're not in fundamental ways trying to reimagine the university. And this particularly is hitting home for me during the times of COVID. And just, right now I'm teaching, like I'm a visiting assistant professor at a public institution in California, and just seeing how students are just being done away with. They don't have the institutional support they need to survive this era of remote learning, vis-a-vis mental health, adequate housing, funding to attend school, to maintain their time, at whatever part in their trajectory they're in, to finish or to just carry on their trajectory. Food, right? There's food scarcity is like so high at my public institution, right? And if anything, I've seen the university back off in so many ways and not really dealing with these imminent crises. And so what my fear is that, it's great. My fear is that once again, the university gets to exploit these very important narratives, right, that are trying to flip the script and trying to disavow the university's kind of cannibalistic orientation towards Black people, Indigenous people, right, that they just use us up. All institutions in this country are built on Indigenous land, period. That's a starter. That's just from the jump. Enslaved people were used to fund, they were the capital used to fund the majority of these institutions. If not, so, the post-Reconstruction era, Jim Crow, right? Separate but equal, like the funds that white people were able to accumulate by wholeheartedly shutting Black people outside of the quote unquote market. Like this is how universities and institutions get to build themselves, maintain themselves, and we're living in the aftermath of that. And with a phenomenon like COVID-19, these works are great and amazing, and I hope something changes, but I'm not very optimistic just because of just the mountain we have to climb, the sheer unwillingness of institutions to do what's right and to really reckon with these histories and give up what they've stolen in many ways.
Thank you all. Again, I think you all are beautiful and brilliant thinkers. It's really, really beautiful to hear these plurality of viewpoints and thinking about kind of the institution as it animates these films and also our lives. So kind of last question, I'll do one other question after this, just final thoughts, but I'm thinking a lot about, given, the theme of kind of storytelling in our voices, I'm curious about what you all think about like the role of storytelling, narrative, the griot in these films, but also how that kind of dialogues with like the arts. I think about film obviously as like an artistic medium and so many other artistic mediums in dialogue. So be it, Decarius performing music, the musicians and artists in North Philly, also in Philadelphia with Penn, the fashion designers, visual art. I'm curious how you all are thinking about like storytelling and the arts as part of the films that we engage.
I think it's one thing to tell a story through the pages of a book, or just like a straight ahead documentary, but in my opinion, music and art are kind of the front lines of culture. Like I think there's something visceral about Robert Johnson with an acoustic guitar, or Biggie Smalls with a microphone and a beat behind him, and it speaks directly to such a wide swath of people, and it's so immediate that I think it influences a lot of what we do as people. Like it's there like the air, so we can't help but take it in and absorb its messages. And so I feel as though, like, even more so than a storytelling component, I feel as though it is a vital part of culture that at this point, who knows what would exist without it.
Yeah, I agree, Martin, that, how can we narrate, I think a certain type of narrativity is so intimately linked to Black sound and like the Black music, or the modes of sounding that Black people engage in. And so I think it would be very hard to, try to imagine Black film without sound, and so I think there's a calabash player in Before Things Fell Apart, and I was thinking like, this mode of amplification sounds like, Jimi Hendrix playing through an amplifier. And it was just so crazy to think about like the way that modes of sounding are happening in and through these films that, that Black folk across continents are, engaging in practices that are producing sounds that are like similar and like that deeply resonate, at least for me. And I don't think that you can engage in modes of Black storytelling without, you can't circumvent Black sound in that. I see that so crystally in Temple as well, right? That sound is being used to recreate space, to reclaim space that Black folk have been disappeared from in North Philadelphia, right? The filmmaker is very intentional about bringing in Black artists, rappers, singers, into these spaces, again, as a way of reclaiming space and to try and, disavow the modes of encroachment that are happening like daily in North Philadelphia by way of Temple University. I mean, sound is all through these works, and I don't know if folk got to screen In My Skin, but it was just like the same, you know, like thinking about the context of Brazil and the way that Brazil tries to perform itself as a racial democracy, and the way that sound is being used in that space, and singers and rappers and musicians, Black singer, rappers and musicians, Black Brazilians, are using sound to disrupt, right, the kind of colonial logics that are so vital to a place like Brazil as a quote unquote racial democracy. So I think all of these films are using Black sound to animate Black narrativity. And I don't think in some ways you can think Black narrativity outside of Black sound.
I think you both raise interesting points about either the sound, but also like how that's a vehicle for the story. And so when I think of storytelling done through film, to me, it's just a core part of like how we understand the world, whether you're as a kid and hearing in your random folktales, or when you're an adult and reading or watching or listening to someone tell a story. And so I think that's the role of the arts for me. Like, are y'all familiar with the, there's a parable about, or story about how like 7 blind men enter a room, and they're all asked to describe what they find in there, and it's an elephant, but they're all touching different parts of the elephant, and so they get different perspectives. Like one says, oh, it's this long skinny thing and it's because they've got the tail, and another says it's really like a column and they've got the you know, the leg or whatever. And to me, it's these storytelling through the arts is a bit like getting multiple visuals, right? It's getting multiple perspectives. And so if you are more attuned to like pop culture, for example, then hearing, you know, someone tell the story of the, like to your point, Brittnay, about the different rappers that were in Temple, right? But hearing, you can hear about what the university is doing, but then you can also hear it through a verse that someone is spitting, and it hits you differently. And that's what someone can bring to it. That's what the griots reminded me of. Like, really what the filmmaker Zuberi was doing there was talking to scholars who had access to the books, who had access to the written word, right? And saying, this is what this says in Arabic about what this culture is. But then you have the griot also saying, I'm sitting in your house and I'm telling you the story while plucking a guitar about what this story is. And it's kind of like multi-layered, getting you to understand, but in a couple different ways, right? And to me, that's actually what, you know, propelled me to do like a whole career switch of like, how can the arts be utilized that way? Because they hit differently if you're not going to pick up a book. They hit differently if you're not going to attend a lecture. Granted, all of us are attending lectures right now because, you know, the pandemic, and that's all we're doing. But if we weren't, then what are the other ways in which people can, who are the folks who are able to do that translating from the formal ways of knowing to something that hits the average person in the places where they are and where they live? And I think, to me, I see that as a huge opportunity when it comes especially for Black folks to understand our, you know, culture on the continent, culture here, history in general, and how it hits us. It's a different way when you're trying to maybe process everything that's going on all the time that tries to minimize who you are, and then have these elevated forms that really expand that idea of who we are as well. So that's what the story is to me. It's a multifaceted way of understanding who we are.
Beautiful. Brilliant. Amazing. Thank you all. So I just want to give space if folks have any last thoughts. This is a conversation that's been really mind-blowing, kind of beyond even what I thought it would be. And I really appreciate how you all are really, you know, having us think about the films with so much depth, nuance, theory, practice, coming from your own personal viewpoints, and also coming from kind of various politics that is centering Blackness in a way that I find really affirming and makes me want to tear up with happy tears. So I'd love just to hear if there are any other thoughts that y'all want to share, anything that kind of came up for you in this conversation.
One thing that stood out to me going back to the griots is that I feel as though rap music is kind of the modern day griot, and like Black music in general, because we're still telling our stories, we're still telling the stories of our people. And that really stood out to me, especially like in the interludes in Temple, where they would have rappers telling the story of North Philadelphia. And it was really inspiring to me that through so many years of colonization and oppression and marginalization, that we as people are still telling our stories and passing them down from generation to generation. That's how we've been persevering all this time.
I was, I think, really impressed by the variety of work that's available to see. Like, it's exciting to realize that people are creating, interested, researching, and putting this kind of work together. And some of them are very young, and some of them have been doing this for a long time. And that gives me a lot of hope, I think, of just like, yeah, there's a lot going on. And all, like in my notes, I was like, snap this, and that's amazing. And oh my goodness, I got really excited. So it's really heartwarming, and I am thankful for opportunities like this that pull this together, because I don't know that we would have known, right, that these were all being made and this work was being done. So that was what struck me, is just the variety of work that's being done. It's the breadth of it. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, Adetola, I agree. It's so it makes me feel like, dang, I need to like support Black filmmakers. Like, I need to find a way. I like need to get my you know what together and like find a way to support Black filmmakers, because there's such an array of like work being done, and like you know, the Hollywood machine would have you thinking that Black folk aren't creating film and making work. And so it's just been a pleasure for me to be able to watch the work of Black filmmakers, watch works that are trying to really narrate and animate Black life across the globe, and in ways that are trying to think about, you know, how we can get free. So like, I'm so, I feel so honored to be able to watch these films. And I definitely want to do better in supporting Black filmmakers in whatever way that I can. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. And yeah, all those points are really great. And yes, I think, yes, let's support Black filmmakers. And then I want to just shout out to the Seattle Black Film Festival for doing that, and Langston for being this amazing hub of Black excellence in Seattle and beyond. I want to thank our amazing, brilliant, beautiful panelists, Dr. Adetola Abatan, Martin Douglas, and Dr. Brittnay Proctor. You all are brilliant. I love how you think and interpret, and this has been really expansive for me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to just say thank you for watching the Seattle Black Film Festival 2021. It's 2021, y'all, 2021. Please connect at langstonseattle.org/SBFF to the SBFF 2021 official selection and ticketing information, and have a great rest of the festival. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.